She caused a scandal in a café, mistaking the wrong millionaire for someone else, and his mother immediately decided she should be her son's bride. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And when the story ends, don't forget to give it a score from 0 to 10. Enjoy! I wasn't supposed to be at that café. My meetings had ended early, and I stopped in for a black coffee and 5 minutes of peace before heading back to the office. I wasn't even looking at anyone in particular when I noticed a young woman staring daggers across the room. Her eyes were locked on me with the kind of intensity usually reserved for courtroom dramas or wild reality shows. Before I could even take a sip of my coffee, she stood, her chair screeching against the floor, and marched toward my table like a storm in heels. "You disgusting cheat," she shouted, slamming her palms on my table so hard the spoons rattled. The entire cafe fell silent. Heads turned. Phones were lifted discreetly to record. I blinked at her, more confused than offended. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, steady but baffled. She pointed to the woman seated beside me. "A business associate from Zurich, reviewing project contracts. How dare you sit here parading your mistress in broad daylight when your fiancé is at home planning a wedding? Do you think women are blind? Do you think we don't talk? I know who you are." Her voice carried through every corner of the café. The poor woman next to me nearly choked on her cappuccino. She wasn't my mistress. She wasn't even remotely connected to me outside of the deal we were negotiating. But the girl before me clearly believed she'd caught a criminal in the act. I leaned back, strangely entertained. "You know who I am, do you?" "Yes," she barked. "You're Henry Walker, the lying fiancé of my best friend, and today you've been exposed." The crowd gasped. My associate started to protest, but I raised a hand. "Miss, my name is Daniel Mercer. And I don't believe I've ever been engaged to anyone named Henry Walker." The silence that followed was brutal. Her face turned crimson. She glanced at me, then at my associate, then at the crowd of gawking strangers with phones raised. "Wait, what?" she whispered. That was the moment my mother, seated 2 tables away, yes, my mother, rose slowly with a faint smile playing on her lips. Elegant as ever, pearls resting perfectly against her collar, she glided toward us like this entire scene was theater she'd been waiting for. "Darling," she said to me, ignoring the chaos, "you really should marry this one." The cafe erupted in laughter. The girl looked at her, horrified. "Excuse me? I just accused your son of cheating in public." "Exactly," my mother replied with a satisfied nod. "You have courage. Honesty. Fire. Traits this family desperately needs." She placed a hand on my arm. "Daniel, propose. Right here." I nearly spilled my coffee. "Mother. Now." The girl stared at me, speechless, as my mother turned toward the crowd. "Everyone here will be our witness." And so, in the middle of a cafe scandal I didn't start, I found myself forced into a proposal to a stranger whose name I didn't even know. The absurdity should have ended there. But I could already feel the weight of inevitability pressing on my chest. Because when my mother decided on something, it always became reality. And the girl? She looked like she might faint. But she didn't run. Not yet. If anyone had told me a week earlier that I'd be standing in a government building, signing marriage papers with a woman whose name I had only learned hours after proposing, I would have called them insane. Yet there I was, Daniel Mercer, respected hotel magnate, playing the lead in what felt like the most absurd farce of my life. Her name, I eventually discovered, was Emily. She had avoided me after the cafe fiasco, her pride clearly wounded, her eyes darting away whenever our paths crossed during the strange days that followed. But my mother? She treated Emily as though she had been born into our family. "She is perfect," she declared every morning. "A woman who isn't afraid to speak the truth, even when it hurts. You need someone like that." I tried reason. I tried refusal. But my mother had the relentless conviction of a general. Within 48 hours she had convinced Emily's bewildered parents, secured a date at the registry office, and arranged for a ceremony so stripped of romance it bordered on comical. The morning of the wedding, Emily stood beside me in a simple blue dress, her lips pressed tightly together, her arms crossed as if she were bracing for impact. I wore a tailored suit, but I felt ridiculous. This was no celebration. This was a negotiation neither of us had agreed to. The clerk looked at us with bored detachment. "Do you, Daniel Mercer, take this woman?" I glanced sideways at Emily. Her eyes were fierce, daring me to say no. And for a brief, unexplainable moment, I wondered what would happen if I actually said yes. "I do," I heard myself say. Her head whipped toward me, disbelief written across her face. But then, without missing a beat, she exhaled and muttered, "Fine. I do." The papers were signed. The witnesses stamped their approval. And just like that, we were married. No champagne. No kiss. Not even flowers. Only my mother's radiant smile, as if she had orchestrated the perfect symphony. On the ride home, Emily finally spoke, her voice sharp. "I hope you realize this is temporary. I will not play house with you. Your mother may think I'm perfect, but I think you're arrogant." I almost laughed. At least we agree on something. I don't intend to play husband either. We sat in silence for the rest of the drive, our reflections flickering in the tinted windows like strangers caught in the same storm. That evening, I opened the door of my penthouse and watched as she stepped inside. She froze, her eyes widening at the marble floors, the skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of luxury most people only see in glossy magazines. Her hand tightened on her small bag as though she feared leaving fingerprints on the air itself. "This is where you live?" she asked. "For now," I replied. "And until we figure out how to untangle this, it's where you'll live too." She turned, her eyes flashing. "Don't think for one second that this makes us a couple. We're nothing but neighbors forced into the same cage." I poured myself a drink, letting her words hang between us. "Neighbors with a shared name," I said calmly. "Neighbors who just became a story neither of us will be able to explain away." She didn't answer. She walked straight to the guest bedroom, slammed the door, and left me standing in the silence of my own home, already wondering how long I could survive this arrangement without losing either my patience or my mind. And that night, as I listened to the faint creak of the floorboards under her restless steps, I realized something chilling: this marriage without a wedding was only the beginning. Because when two enemies are locked in the same house, war is inevitable. The first morning of our so-called married life began with the unmistakable scent of smoke. I jolted awake, certain the penthouse was on fire. Throwing on a robe, I rushed to the kitchen only to find Emily standing amid chaos, flowers scattered across the marble counters, eggshells littering the floor, and smoke curling ominously from the toaster. She held a frying pan like a weapon, eyes wide, face flushed. "I was making breakfast," she announced defensively before I could even open my mouth. "Making breakfast or declaring war on the kitchen?" I asked dryly, grabbing the smoking pan from her hands and tossing it into the sink. She glared at me. Not all of us grew up with chefs preparing gourmet meals every morning. Her tone stung, not because she was wrong, but because she said it with such venom, as if privilege was a crime. I opened the refrigerator, pulled out fruit and yogurt, and slid them onto the counter. "Next time, just start with this. Less chance of burning the place down." She muttered something under her breath and stormed out, leaving me to clean the battlefield she'd left behind. That was only the beginning. By noon, I returned from a meeting to find the living room rearranged, my Italian leather sofa pushed against the wrong wall, shelves stripped bare, my books scattered across the floor like fallen soldiers. Emily stood in the center, surveying her handiwork with the self-satisfaction of a conqueror. "What in God's name have you done?" I demanded. The space was cold, she said, unbothered. I'm adding warmth. Warmth? I gestured at the chaos. You've turned a meticulously designed interior into a student dorm. She crossed her arms. Maybe that's the problem. No life. Just sterile perfection. People should be able to breathe in their own home. It is my home, I reminded her. Her chin lifted. Correction, our home. At least for now. I should have been furious. I was furious. But beneath the anger was an odd amusement. She was fearless, completely unafraid to challenge me in a way no one else dared. Everyone else in my life either wanted my approval or feared my disapproval. Emily, however, treated me like an obstacle to be shoved aside. So I retaliated. That evening, while she was in the shower, I quietly returned every piece of furniture to its original position, stacking her improvements neatly in the corner. When she emerged and saw it, her mouth dropped open. You can't be serious, she snapped. Deadly serious, I replied smoothly. If you're going to move my things, be prepared for me to move yours back. Her eyes narrowed. Fine. Then this is war. The next morning, I found every one of my ties tied together in a long rope hanging from the balcony like some absurd piece of modern art. She was waiting in the kitchen, sipping coffee with a smirk. I poured myself a cup, sat across from her, and whispered, "You've made a mistake." And then, for the first time since this insane arrangement began, we both laughed. Not politely. Not forced. A real laugh, echoing through the apartment until even the walls seemed to soften. It wasn't peace. Far from it. But in that laugh, in that ridiculous tie rope swaying on the balcony, I sensed the war between us was shifting. Because sometimes, enemies stop fighting long enough to realize they're enjoying the battle. I never thought I'd dread going into my own hotel, but that morning I walked through the revolving glass doors with a heaviness pressing on my chest. Emily had insisted she didn't need me to babysit her, but the thought of her colliding with the wolves in my company made me restless. She had returned to her position at the front office, determined to prove she wasn't just the boss's accidental bride. She wanted to earn her place, she said. Brave words. But bravery in this building was often punished. The lobby gleamed as usual, marble polished to perfection, guests gliding across with luggage, staff whispering rehearsed greetings. Yet beneath that sheen, tension coiled. I spotted her instantly at the reception desk, hair tied back, uniform crisp. She looked professional, poised, almost too composed. But then my eyes moved to the far corner where she was being watched. Clara. Clara had been circling this hotel like a shark for years. Once Emily's peer, she'd clawed her way up the ladder to become head of guest relations. Ruthless, calculating, always smiling at the right people, Clara thrived on subtle cruelty. She had once angled for my attention too, though I dismissed her without a thought. Clearly, she hadn't forgiven me. At noon, the trap was sprung. A foreign investor was scheduled to meet with our financial consultant, a man I hadn't seen in years but recognized instantly when he walked through the lobby. David. My wife's old flame, the one she had never quite forgiven for betraying her friend. I saw Emily's expression freeze the moment their eyes met, the color draining from her cheeks. Clara had orchestrated this, I could see her satisfaction radiating from across the room. Emily, escort Mr. Daniels to the lounge, Clara ordered sweetly, loud enough for others to hear. Emily obeyed, but I could sense her unraveling. David leaned close, too close, whispering with a smirk that made her stiffen. Guests were watching. Staff were whispering. And then, the inevitable happened. A reservation mix-up. Not Emily's fault, I saw the file myself later. Clara had swapped the schedules, ensuring chaos. The investor erupted in frustration. David pretended to mediate but subtly fanned the flames, making it appear as if Emily was incompetent. Voices rose. A small crowd gathered. And there she stood, my fiery, fearless accidental wife, frozen in public humiliation. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to intervene. Every instinct screamed at me to march over, tear the scene apart, and drag her out. But I knew if I did, it would only confirm what Clara wanted everyone to believe, that Emily's only power came from being Mrs. Mercer. So I watched her falter, her voice trembling as she apologized to the guest, her hands shaking as she scrambled to fix the error that wasn't hers. Clara smirked from the sidelines, savoring every second of Emily's downfall. By the time the situation was salvaged, the damage was done. Guests whispered about the chaos, staff exchanged knowing looks, and Emily stood there, pale, humiliated, her confidence fractured. That evening, back at the penthouse, she said nothing. She sat by the window, staring at the skyline, her reflection blurred in the glass. When I finally spoke, she didn't turn. "They set you up." "I know," she whispered, her voice brittle. "And tomorrow they'll do it again." I wanted to promise her I'd stop it, that I'd crush Clara and anyone else who dared. But something inside me hesitated. Because I realized Emily didn't want rescue, she wanted to fight. And the worst part? Tomorrow, she'd walk straight into another battlefield. The next morning, Emily insisted on leaving before me. She dressed in silence, hair pulled into a determined knot, lips pressed tight as though sheer willpower would protect her from the knives waiting at the hotel. I watched her walk out, a small figure against the backdrop of the city, and for the first time since this insane marriage began, I felt something strange, pride. She wasn't running. She was marching back into enemy territory with her chin lifted high. But pride can't shield you from sabotage. By noon I received a dozen messages, whispers from department heads, murmurs that Emily had been blamed again. This time, it wasn't a reservation error. It was cash, missing from a guest's deposit envelope. Not much by my standards, but enough to make the accusation sting. Clara, of course, was the one who discovered it. She demanded a full inquiry, loudly, in front of staff and guests alike. Emily stood there, cornered, cheeks flaming, refusing to cry. That's when the lobby doors opened, and my mother swept in. You have to understand, my mother doesn't simply enter a room. She conquers it. Dressed in ivory, pearls gleaming against her collar, she moved like a queen surveying her court. Every employee froze. Even Clara faltered, though only for a second. "What is happening here?" my mother demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. Clara attempted her sweetest tone. "Mrs. Mercer, there has been a theft. We're investigating, and unfortunately Emily." "Emily?" My mother's eyebrow arched. "Emily Mercer, my daughter-in-law. Are you accusing her of stealing pocket change from guests while she is married to the man who owns this building?" Clara paled. "It's procedure." "No," my mother snapped. "It's slander. And I will not have my family humiliated by jealous incompetence." She turned to the gathered employees, her voice rising. "You will remember this day, because it marks the moment everything changes." The crowd was silent, stunned. Emily looked at me, wide-eyed, as my mother strode forward and took her hand. "From this moment," she announced, "Emily Mercer is Vice President of Guest Relations. Effective immediately." The gasp that swept through the lobby was almost theatrical. Clara staggered back, her face drained of color. Emily froze, caught between disbelief and outrage. "Wait, what?" she whispered. My mother smiled serenely. "You will not be anyone's scapegoat again. If they try to break you, they will answer to me." She glanced around, her eyes sharp as daggers. "And to him." All eyes turned to me. I hadn't planned this, hadn't even imagined it, yet in that moment I found myself stepping forward, sliding an arm lightly around Emily's waist, claiming her not just as my wife but as my equal. "She has my full support," I said, my voice steady. "And anyone who doubts her will answer directly to me." The staff murmured. Clara looked as though she might choke on her own rage. Emily, however, was trembling, not from fear, but from shock. She managed a stiff nod, her fingers tightening around mine for balance. That evening, back at the penthouse, she paced like a caged animal. Vice President? Without asking me? Without even warning me? I leaned against the window, watching her reflection. Would you have accepted? Of course not, she snapped. They already think I'm here because of you, and now your mother just handed me power on a silver platter. Do you have any idea how this looks? I crossed the room slowly, stopping just inches away. It looks like you finally have the authority to fight back. The only question is, will you? Her eyes met mine, defiant, conflicted, burning with something I couldn't quite name. And that's when I knew, the war inside the hotel had just begun. And Emily was no longer on the defensive. Power changes a person. Sometimes it corrupts them, sometimes it crushes them, but in Emily's case, it ignited something fierce I had never seen before. The day after my mother's declaration, she walked into the hotel not as an accused receptionist but as vice president of guest relations. Whispers followed her every step. Some were curious, some envious, others openly hostile. Yet she carried herself with surprising calm, as though the title wasn't a burden but a weapon she intended to wield carefully. Her first test arrived sooner than anyone expected. That afternoon, a young housekeeper named Marco was dragged into the security office, accused of stealing a guest's designer watch. The evidence looked damning, the watch had been discovered in his cleaning cart. Clara, still licking her wounds from her public humiliation, demanded immediate dismissal. We cannot allow thieves in this hotel, she declared, her voice dripping with triumph, eager to reclaim her authority through someone else's downfall. Emily stepped forward, steady but sharp. And yet, Clara, we cannot condemn a man without understanding how the watch found its way there. The room froze. No one dared to contradict Clara before, but Emily wasn't afraid. She asked Marco to sit, then turned to the staff who had discovered the watch. Who searched his cart? Who confirmed it belonged to the missing guest? And who had access to the storage room where the carts are kept? Her questions came rapid fire, slicing through assumptions. I watched from the corner, astonished. This was no timid girl fumbling through her role. She was precise, relentless, and oddly compassionate. Marco swore he was innocent, tears trembling at the edges of his voice. Most would have dismissed it as desperation. Emily, however, leaned closer. Tell me everything you did this morning. Every room you cleaned. Every door you entered. His story matched the logs. But something didn't sit right with her. She requested the security footage from the hallway outside the storage room. Minutes later, there it was, grainy but undeniable. Another employee slipping into Marco's cart when his back was turned. A man I recognized instantly, Victor, one of the senior attendants, drowning in debt. Gasps filled the room. Clara's face tightened as Emily stood, holding the remote like a gavel. Marco is innocent. Victor, however, has something to explain. Security escorted Victor out as he sputtered excuses. Emily turned back to Marco, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. You keep your job. And your dignity. His eyes filled with gratitude. The silence that followed was different from before. No whispers of mockery, no smirks of doubt. Only respect. Real, grudging, undeniable respect. Even I, a man who prided himself on control, felt a flicker of awe. She hadn't just defended an employee, she had exposed corruption, saved a man's livelihood, and in doing so, earned her first true victory. Later that evening, she walked into my office, exhausted but glowing with a quiet fire. You saw what happened, she said. I did, I replied, leaning back in my chair. You turned a scandal into a triumph. My board should take lessons from you. She shook her head. Don't flatter me. Tomorrow they'll test me again. I stood, moving closer, lowering my voice. And tomorrow, you'll win again. Because today, you proved something no title could ever give you. Her eyes met mine, steady but softer than I had ever seen them. And what's that? That you're a leader, I whispered. She didn't reply. She simply turned, her shoulders straighter, her chin higher, and left me standing in the silence of my office, strangely shaken. Because in that moment, I realized my accidental wife wasn't just surviving this world. She was beginning to own it. Victories in business are never permanent. For every fire you put out, another blaze begins in the shadows. Emily's triumph with Marco sent ripples through the hotel. Employees looked at her differently, with respect, some with admiration, others with fear. But to Clara, and to those who thrived on manipulation, it was a declaration of war. And war, I knew, was coming. It arrived in the form of numbers. Spreadsheets, financial reports, quarterly summaries that were supposed to flow seamlessly to our parent company's headquarters. But buried inside them, subtle discrepancies began to appear. Small at first, an extra expense here, a miscalculated percentage there. Nothing that couldn't be explained away as human error. Until the errors multiplied, building a narrative that painted Emily as careless, incompetent, and possibly dishonest. She noticed first. She came storming into my office one evening, a stack of papers clutched to her chest, eyes blazing. These aren't mine. These figures, these notes, someone's altered them after I signed off. I skimmed the documents, my stomach tightening. It wasn't sloppy sabotage. It was elegant. Precise. Designed to collapse under scrutiny, but only after reaching the wrong hands. They're framing you, I said grimly. Her voice trembled, though she stood tall. And if I don't fix this, I'll be branded a fraud before I've even had a chance to prove myself. 2 days later, the summons arrived. A request from the parent company for Emily to attend a meeting with top management. No lawyers, no advisors, just her. To defend herself. To explain why her department had submitted misleading data. That morning, she stood in front of the mirror, pale but resolute, adjusting the lapel of her blazer with shaking fingers. I had seen her furious, sarcastic, even triumphant, but never like this, never bracing herself for a battlefield she hadn't chosen. You don't have to go alone, I told her. She shook her head firmly. If I show up with you, they'll believe the rumors. That I'm just your wife playing executive. No. This is my fight. And so she went. The conference room on the 47th floor was designed for intimidation, long table, cold lighting, walls of glass that made even powerful men feel small against the skyline. I sat outside, waiting, because she refused to let me inside. Through the glass, I watched her take her seat at the far end, a dozen executives staring at her like predators evaluating prey. They attacked swiftly, presenting the doctored reports, demanding explanations, their voices sharp and relentless. For a moment, I feared she would crumble. But then she rose, walked to the projector, and pulled out a flash drive. I anticipated this, she said, her voice clear and steady. So I brought the originals. One by one, she displayed the untouched files, time-stamped, digitally secured, backed by independent verification from our IT system. She didn't raise her voice, didn't beg. She simply dismantled every accusation with the calm precision of a surgeon. By the time she finished, the room was silent. One executive cleared his throat and muttered, "Impressive." Another shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Emily returned to her chair, her eyes locked on the man who had led the attack. Clara's ally. You can keep trying to discredit me, she said softly, but you'll find I document everything. And I don't forget. The meeting ended in uneasy quiet. When she emerged, she found me waiting in the corridor. For a long moment, she just looked at me, her composure cracking, her breath unsteady. They tried to destroy me, she whispered. I touched her hand gently. And you destroyed them instead. But what struck me most wasn't her victory. It was the stunned revelation that followed. Because later that evening, when the board released its updated corporate structure, I saw a name I hadn't expected. Mine. President. The company wasn't just a hotel. It was a global empire. And my accidental wife had just discovered that the man she had been battling with in kitchens and boardrooms was the very president she'd unknowingly defended herself before. Her eyes met mine across the page. Betrayal, fury, and something deeper swirled there. You, she whispered. All this time, it was you. And in that moment, I realized the greatest test was not the data. It was us. For days after the revelation, Emily barely looked at me. She came home late, buried herself in work, and closed the door to the guest room with a firmness that was impossible to mistake. Every time I tried to explain, she cut me off. You let me stand in front of you, in front of all of them, humiliated, thinking you were just another executive. And you said nothing. You lied by silence. She wasn't wrong. I had hidden my full position, not out of malice but out of cowardice. I wanted to see who she was when she thought I wasn't the man with all the power. But in doing so, I had created a chasm between us. One evening, after another dinner eaten in silence, I finally spoke. Emily, if you want this marriage to remain nothing more than a contract, we'll go on this way. But if you want to know the truth about me, not the company, not the position, but me, then meet me tomorrow night. 8 o'clock. I'll be waiting. She didn't answer, but I saw the flicker of conflict in her eyes. The next evening, I reserved a small Italian restaurant tucked in a quiet street, far from the polished lobbies and sterile boardrooms. No staff, no reporters, no mother, no Clara. Just us. Candles flickered on linen-covered tables, violins played softly in the background, and for the first time in weeks I felt nervous, genuinely nervous, like a man awaiting judgment. When the door opened, I held my breath. She entered slowly, wearing a simple black dress, her hair falling loose for once, her eyes scanning the room warily before settling on me. She didn't storm out. She didn't turn away. She walked toward me, her steps hesitant but sure. You actually meant it, she said quietly as she sat down. I did, I replied. At first, the air between us was thick with unspoken grievances. I tried to start lightly, telling her about the chef's reputation, but she cut through it. Why didn't you tell me who you were? I took a deep breath. Because everyone sees Daniel Mercer, the president, the millionaire, the man with the skyline behind his name. I wanted to know what you saw when you thought I was just Daniel. Her lips pressed together, as though weighing whether to believe me. Finally, she said, and what did you see in me? I leaned closer. Someone who doesn't care about titles, who challenges me without fear, who can walk into a room full of enemies and still stand taller than any of them. I saw the person I didn't know I needed. For the first time in days, her expression softened. She looked away quickly, but not before I saw the flush rising on her cheeks. The night unfolded in a way I hadn't anticipated. Awkward at first, then easier, lighter. We argued about music, she insisted my playlist was pretentious. We laughed over pasta when she accidentally spilled wine on my sleeve and I tried to mop it up with too much dramatics. The tension dissolved little by little until, by dessert, it felt almost like we had always been meant to sit across from each other in that little restaurant. When the violins began to play a softer tune, I surprised myself by standing and offering her my hand. Dance with me. In the middle of a restaurant, she whispered, scandalized. Why not? I smiled. She hesitated, then placed her hand in mine. And as I held her, as her laughter melted into quiet warmth, something shifted. For the first time since this bizarre marriage began, it didn't feel like performance or battle. It felt real. At the end of the night, outside under the glow of street lamps, I walked her to the car. She paused, staring at me with eyes that were no longer filled with suspicion but something far more dangerous, hope. "Daniel," she whispered. "Yes. Don't make me regret this." Before I could reply, she leaned in and kissed me. Soft at first, then deeper, a kiss that wasn't born of obligation or anger but of surrender. When she finally pulled away, she smiled faintly. Our first real date. And as I watched her step into the car, my heart pounding harder than it had in years, I knew the war was changing. Because in that kiss, I had tasted the beginning of something that terrified me more than any rival or scandal. Love. The morning after our first real date, the world outside felt strangely brighter. Emily moved through the penthouse kitchen with a softness I hadn't seen before, humming under her breath as she made coffee. It was a small thing, but it unsettled me. For weeks we had been adversaries, reluctant allies, strangers forced together. Now, after one dinner, one laugh, and one kiss, the ground beneath us had shifted. But peace never lingers long in my family. That afternoon, I received a call from her mother. A polite voice, trembling but resolute, "Daniel, we'd like to visit. It's been too long since we've seen Emily. And, we have something to discuss." Emily froze when I told her. "No. Not now. Not here. They're your parents," I said carefully. "They're also proud, stubborn people who never approved of me chasing independence. If they see me here, living in a palace with you, they'll think I've sold myself to the highest bidder." "Then let them come and see the truth," I replied. She didn't argue further, but I saw the storm gathering in her eyes. The visit happened 2 days later. Her parents arrived in a modest car, carrying the weight of years of hard work etched in their faces. Her father shook my hand firmly, testing my grip, while her mother clung to Emily as though afraid she might vanish again. We sat in the living room, the skyline sprawling beyond us, and the silence between them felt heavier than any boardroom I had ever entered. Finally, her father spoke. "We didn't come just to see how you live, Daniel. We came because our business is drowning. The family store, the one your wife grew up helping us run, it's collapsing under debt. We need an investor. Someone who believes in us." Emily's face paled. "Dad." He raised a hand. I didn't want to ask. But this is survival. I studied him, then her. She looked torn, embarrassed, desperate to protect them but afraid to admit it. I could have refused. I could have reminded them that I was not in the habit of saving failing ventures. But instead, I said, "Tell me everything." Hours passed. They laid out the accounts, the mistakes, the stubborn pride that had led them here. And when they finished, I leaned back and looked at Emily. "I'll do it. Not as charity. As a partnership." Her eyes widened. "You mean?" "Yes," I said firmly. "We restructure, we modernize, we expand. Your family name remains, but I bring in the capital and connections. We do this together." Her father's shoulders slumped with relief. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Emily, however, sat motionless, staring at me as though she couldn't decide whether to thank me or strangle me. That evening, after her parents left, she confronted me. "Why would you do that? You barely know them. You barely know me." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Because they're your family. And whether you like it or not, that makes them mine too." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, slowly, she whispered, "You don't know what that means to me." I smiled faintly. "Then tell me." She didn't answer. She simply stepped into my arms, her head resting against my chest, her silence saying more than words ever could. And as I held her, I realized something unexpected. This marriage that began as a mistake in a café had begun weaving itself into something neither of us could deny. A family. There are moments when life stops being a performance and becomes frighteningly real. For me, That moment came on a quiet Sunday morning. Emily stood in the doorway of my study, her hands trembling as she held a small white stick. Her lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. "Daniel. I'm pregnant." The words hit me harder than any boardroom confrontation, harder than betrayal, harder than victory. For a second I couldn't move. Then I crossed the room and took her shaking hands in mine. "Are you certain?" She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I took 3 tests. All the same. I had thought I understood power, wealth, success. But none of it compared to the swell of emotion that surged through me at that moment. Fear, joy, disbelief, and an aching tenderness I never expected. I pulled her against me, holding her as tightly as I dared, whispering, "We're going to do this together." But happiness is never left unchallenged. Days later, at a gala evening held to celebrate our company's expansion, trouble arrived in the form of Clara, bitter and vengeful. Dressed in shimmering silver, she cornered Emily in front of investors and executives, her voice sharp enough to slice through the music. "Do you really believe this man loves you, Emily? Or are you just another contract he signed for convenience?" The crowd hushed. Emily froze, her hands instinctively resting against her stomach. I stepped forward, fury building, but before I could speak, Clara leaned closer to me, her words venomous. "You could still have me, Daniel. You don't need to chain yourself to her. Everyone knows she was never your equal." The room seemed to hold its breath. And then Emily, trembling but unbroken, turned to face her. "You're wrong. I never claimed to be his equal. I've made mistakes, I've fought, I've stumbled. But unlike you, I don't measure myself by what I can take from others. I measure myself by what I can build. And Daniel," her voice broke, but she pressed on, "Daniel has stood beside me even when I doubted him. That's more than you'll ever understand." I took her hand in mine, raising it for all to see. "She isn't my equal," I said, my voice firm. "She's my better. And if anyone in this room doubts her place here, then you doubt me." Gasps filled the hall. Clara's face crumpled, her power evaporating in the silence. But before she could retreat, another voice rang out. Deep, commanding. My father's. He had always been a distant figure, more myth than presence, the man who built an empire but rarely showed his face. That night, however, he stepped forward from the shadows, his cane striking the marble floor. He looked at Emily, then at me. "This woman," he declared, "is the first person in years who has had the courage to stand against you, Daniel. And she is the only one who has had the grace to stand with you. She is family. My family." Tears filled Emily's eyes. For the first time, I saw her shoulders truly relax. Recognition. Acceptance. Something she had longed for but never asked me to give. The evening ended not with scandal but with applause. Clara slipped away, defeated. Investors whispered not about betrayal, but about loyalty, resilience, and the strength of a woman who had transformed a mistake into destiny. That night, back in our penthouse, Emily leaned against me on the balcony, the city glowing beneath us. "Do you realize," she said softly, "that all of this started because I mistook you for someone else?" I laughed quietly, pressing a kiss to her hair. "The best mistake of my life." She smiled, placing my hand over her stomach. "Then maybe this child will grow up knowing that sometimes the wrong turn leads exactly where you're meant to be." And as I held her there, the city alive around us, I realized the truth: love had not come to me as a perfect plan or a polished deal. It had come in chaos, in fire, in laughter and tears, in a girl who accused me in a café and ended up giving me everything I never knew I needed. A wife. A family. A future. And this time, it was real.